First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today and discussing what I believe is one of the most important civil rights issues facing our country today, yet is often some of the most overlooked. I'm grateful to Mel and Kathy for providing an overview of these legal cases and shedding light on the important work of NCPCF and Project Salam in monitoring them and educating the public about the erosion of civil liberties and about and in supporting prisoners and their families. Today I'm going to speak to you about my personal experience as a family member who was directly impacted by some of these unjust laws and policies, specifically in the form of the government's relentless persecution and prosecution of my father that was made possible in the midst of post 9/11 fear and hysteria that engulfed our country. I'm going to offer you some stories and little vignettes, from my eyes, the way I experienced these events, because many of them started when I was just a child and how it impacted me. And then finally, I'll offer my own observations and recommendations for how you can best support families who have been through this. Given that our case we had a bittersweet conclusion, unlike many of these ongoing cases. As emotional as it is for me to relive the experiences of my father's over 2-decade-long saga, 12 of those years being his actual legal case, I'm grateful to Mel for providing the summary version as well as a glimpse into our lives in the short video you saw. And if you Google USA versus Al-Arian, you'll find the documentary online available for full viewing. So as you saw in the video, my father's case was entirely a First Amendment case in which he was targeted for his views and activism, specifically supporting the voiceless people in Palestine and around the world, as well as being, a vociferous opponent of the unconstitutional use of secret evidence, which both Kathy and Mel spoke about. Secret evidence was a practice employed under the Clinton administration, and it was primarily used against Arab and Muslim defendants, people who were people who were arrested, and it was being used in immigration courts. So these people weren't charged with a single crime. They were arrested on visa violations, but rather than release or deport them, they would be held indefinitely. So this was legalized by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 that was signed into law by Bill Clinton. So for many of us who've been working on these issues for years, we know that this act of 1996, that Clinton in fact laid the groundwork for the Patriot Act and all of the unjust policies practiced by Bush and expanded, and then also Obama. So one of the more famous cases was actually my uncle, Al-Mazar. He is my mother's brother, and he was arrested in May 1997 on visa violations. He was a graduate student in Tampa, and the reason he was targeted was because the government wanted him to lie against my father, who was their actual target. Again, this was used in some of the cases Kathy talked about. So they offered him the sweet deal: we'll release you, we'll offer you citizenship, just give us something on Sami. Of course, that he had nothing to tell. And so to punish him, he was held, detained, wasn't able to face his accusations. What habeas corpus, what Sixth Amendment, who cares? His attorneys can't see the evidence, he can't see the evidence, we don't know why. So my parents, they worked and they established allies and community leaders and social justice activists, and they worked with attorneys and civil rights activists from all over the country, and they began to lobby Congress. My mother testified before Congress, and even Mel was there when they were knocking door to door until they got, a bill that was going to be passed, H.R. 2121, to ban the use of secret evidence. And At the time, candidate George W. Bush vowed that he would ban the use of this unconstitutional practice in the second presidential debate. And after his election, he was set to meet with American Muslim leaders to announce his administration's support to ban this bill. That meeting, ironically, was set to take place September 11th, 2001. Needless to say, it never happened. So back in Tampa, Florida, where I grew up, we lived a very normal American life. My father took us to theme parks and mini golf and, barbecues, and drove me to piano lessons and taekwondo. But at the same time, he was a dedicated activist, a rising community leader, and who had arrived in the U.S. in June of 1975, almost 42 years ago to the day, as a stateless Palestinian refugee searching for an education, basic freedoms and rights that were denied to refugees in the Middle East. For Palestinians, of course, your education is always your ticket to freedom, and his father had given his life savings to make that dream happen for him. So by the early 1990s, and mind you, I'm just a kid at the time, my father had already established a national organization in support of Palestinian rights, prompted by the events of the First Intifada, a charity supporting orphans and widows, mainly in the Palestinian refugee camps, those who were massacred by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. He published a magazine. He set up a think tank at the University of South Florida, where he taught that sought to bridge the divide between the West and the Muslim world, sort of like the antidote to the so-called clash of civilizations, which he completely rejected. And during the first Gulf War, he was even invited to speak on panels with Edward Said, with John Esposito, addressing military generals, where he warned them against the sort of like Huntingtonian doctrine, and how they deal with the Muslim world, and its, destructive implications. So needless to say, you can see why my father began to form enemies who sought to destroy him. These are the same people who we now know them as forming the broader net of this Islamophobia industry. The same, creatures who, they aim to malign and destroy Muslim activists and leaders in our institutions. And now you see it more with the allies who defend them, against Dr. Kianga Yamada Taylor and the others who they attack, and Linda Sarsour. So it's 1994, and discredited, journalist, a man by the name of Stephen Everson, who literally embodies fake news before fake news was a thing. Like, even his name is fake. It's not really Emerson. 100% an Israeli agent. He made this documentary called Jihad in America, which aired on PBS, which was full of completely baseless allegations against my father and other Muslim leaders, waging this campaign against them. And mind you, Emerson is the same guy who tried to pin the Oklahoma City bombings on Muslims, which of course, and I think the local reporter, who was like one of his minions, tried to, blame my dad specifically somehow for it, like literally. So 1994, this documentary comes out. So in early 95, I want to say, this campaign starts in the newspaper, ties to terrorism, and it's like this whole trying to create this network of conspiracy, at which my dad is the center of it. The newspaper even publishes a map to our house, ostensibly so people can come and attack us and wage some kind of violence against us. So one day, I'm in the 4th grade, I remember this very vividly. My mother's youngest brother, who was just a student at the university, he was living in an apartment around the corner of our street. And, usually the route that he would take to get to his apartment is through our street. You see our house. He picks us up from school, which already was very odd. Like, he normally doesn't pick us up from school, me and my 2 older siblings. And he decides to take this, like, completely long, windy, roundabout way to get to his apartment. And I was like, okay, like, you know, this is cool that we get to go to his house, but, like, why are we still here? Why did you take this way, not this way? And I was, like, probing. And eventually we went home. It was late at night. The place was a mess. And I asked my mom what happened, and she said, we had a cockroach infestation. It was the FBI actually raiding our house, which, you know, she wasn't exactly lying, I guess, to me. But it was a massive raid, and they were there all day, and, you know, and this was, again, in 94, 95. Eventually, my dad was arrested in 2003, so it was entirely a fishing expedition, if not just a way to silence and intimidate him. And I was recounting the story the other day to my mom, and she reminded me that my 2-year-old sister at the time was having nightmares about the men the agents who came in. And my elderly grandmother, she was so traumatized by that experience. She was visiting and staying with us at the time that this garbage, you know, truck, this company in Florida, I don't know if it's national, called BFI. She does not speak English, and she sees this BFI garbage truck outside of our house making a stop to collect the garbage, and she freaked out because she thought it was FBI coming back. Yeah, and you know, it never resulted in any crime or anything. Fast forward a few months, my dad is out of town, and my mom is asleep. Us kids are, you know, we were all asleep. It was in the early hours of the morning. My mom received, you know, she hears a loud banging on the door. It's a police officer coming in. Knocking on the door. So she opens, and he said, we received a complaint because your neighbor all the way down the street is saying that you keep throwing your garbage in their garbage bins. And my mom's like, what? Like, we don't do that. And he said, well, you know, your neighbor keeps complaining. He keeps finding your garbage in his bins down the street. So she tells him, my son is too lazy to drag our garbage bins from, like, the garage to the street. Like, none of us are going to go and throw it over there. Fast forward, you know, maybe like 9 years after we're reviewing the discovery, there's an entire spreadsheet in a category called trash. All the garbage, you know, the so-called evidence that they collected from digging in our trash.
And they put it in somebody else's trash?
Yeah, like they would cut it open and like take what they want, and then they would like put it in some neighbor's trash.
So the neighbors were right.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was there, it just wasn't us doing it. And so, I mean, we always knew that they were, you know, that we were being surveilled. You know, just that constant feeling of security and privacy is something that was we were deprived of very early on. I actually, till this day, I have a stress dream that somebody is like peering into the windows, because that used to, like, they used to go into our backyard, and this is Florida, and, you know, everybody has pools and glass doors, and you can hear them, and you feel like they were watching us or something. My father's office was in an exterior pool house, and we had an alarm system. So one night, the alarm system goes off, you know, and my mom sees them, they turn the light on, like, they're not even subtle. And then she reset the alarm, and then when they left, it went off again. Our phone calls were recorded, you know, probably as early as when I ever started making phone calls as a child. Long before there was Edward Snowden, before there was the NSA leaks, metadata, spying, my family was being listened to and surveilled thanks to FISA warrants, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I don't even know if a FISA warrant has ever been denied in the history of the court.
I think it was twice, but then they appealed
and then they got it again, yeah. So like every time they sought to renew it, it was like, sure, you know, like go ahead. So not only was my father's phone calls being listened to and recorded, my phone calls were being listened to and recorded. My sister's phone calls, my brother. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From the second that you pick up the receiver, it starts recording. So imagine years and years later, you're given a ton of boxes with CDs with like every conversation that you ever had in your life. And like, you know, I was a pretty good kid, but like I did some stuff, like we all did stuff. Imagine your father's in jail reviewing, you know, all the discovery. And I'm sitting here panicking like, oh my God, like trying to revisit every, you know, thing that I've ever done or talked about and like that my dad might listen to. It's like, is today the day that I'm going to get a scolding through the plexiglass? Like, I don't know. Thank God he had, you know, bigger fish to fry, so to say the least. You know, I could tell you stories all day, but for lack of time, you know, but it's, again, these feelings of feeling, you know, completely exposed. And till this day, we have them. And then for, like, being conspiratorial and then having all your suspicions confirmed. At trial, it came out that there was a guy who was literally, his sole job was hired by the government to just follow my father around everywhere, just taking pictures of him. And I think our lawyer one time made a joke that, like, here he is in the dangerous pursuit of lunch, you know. But, you know, there's so many things to talk about when it comes to this case, but, you know, give me a couch to lie on and I'll tell you all my trauma of witnessing his arrest, you know, my father's arrest, the government taking him away, knowing that he's innocent, men in SWAT gear like uniforms. You know, the night he was arrested, I was at home, my two younger siblings, loud banging on the door, coming in, guns pointed at our face. And for what? I mean, what did they end up taking from our house? So one of the most revealing things that even came out at trial to prove that this was truly nothing more than a First Amendment case was, you know, these two large posters, pictures that the government took during their second raid when they arrested my dad in 2003. So our lawyer blew up. One picture was a stack of books that the government took with them that they confiscated from our house. The other poster was a revolver that we had because, you know, we live in Florida, so like but it was like locked away in a closet. So what does it tell you when the government decides to take books, but they leave the gun? You know, is this man truly a violent man, or is this just a means to, you know, to target American Muslim leaders and make an example? And my father's case was the first major terrorism case, and the government sought to shake the Muslim community, to make us submit and be silent and be fearful, and it worked, unfortunately. You know, I can talk about the prison conditions, the years-long solitary confinement that you saw somebody in a windowless cell. He was held 23, sometimes 24 hours a day in solitary confinement. Mind you, this is a man who hadn't even been convicted of anything yet. This was all in pre-trial. The strip searches. He would be strip searched before and after a non-contact visit. We had, you know, I don't know how many inches of plexiglass. We had to go through metal detectors as family members. You know, if we were wearing the wrong kind of undergarments, they would send us away. You know, and yet they would still subject him to these punitive strip searches just intended to humiliate him. When he would visit, have his attorney visits, they would make him bend over and handcuff him and have him, like a mule, carry all his legal documents on his back, rather than allow, at least handcuff him in the front so that he could carry them like a, human being. So he would have to suffer these daily humiliations. And this is part of my experience, as a family member, just being now, entangled in the criminal justice system. And this isn't by any means an experience unique to me. I mean, it may have been more punitive, as is the case of all the Muslim prisoners in other cases, but it's certainly something that we see with, just like regular family members who drive for days, hours and hours, and they'll send them away for any sort of arbitrary reason. In some ways, these experiences now feel pretty distant. I mean, my father has been deported now for 2 years, and thankfully, he's a free man, unlike many of these people who weren't able to, gain their freedom. I feel that the government felt that it needed to learn its lesson from the humiliating defeat that they experienced, and so Congress changed the laws after my father was not convicted, along with his co-defendants. And with Holy Land, they didn't have to be, the money didn't have to directly fund violence. They didn't even have to establish that money went to violence, because they said that, okay, you're giving to the Hamas charities, so now you're freeing up money so that Hamas can use it to commit violent acts, which is a complete joke. And as Kathy mentioned, it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2010.
Like Tariq Mahana's case.
Yeah, exactly. So the outcome of my father's case is definitely the exception and not the rule. And this was a $50 million trial done over a 6-month period. And, again, the evidence that they presented were books my father read, articles he wrote, journals he edited, websites he never accessed. Yeah, exactly. This is particularly infamous, was a dream that somebody had that, they recounted to a friend or something. Somehow that was supposed to be, evidence. So I want to, give you some takeaways, I guess, from our experience. Even when you beat the U.S. government, we learned that you never really win. Ultimately my father had to leave the country after they tried to get him in other ways. And so, an overzealous, very right-wing prosecutor in Virginia tried to target him again. He used the contempt trap to keep bringing him, and eventually, to testify against other people. And my dad would refuse. He eventually charged him with criminal contempt. So eventually the government dropped the charges after the judge wouldn't rule on the case for years. And so, number 2, the hallmark of the Bush era was a policy to aggressively silence and punish any dissenting views. And I think one of the experiences that really affected us was the abandonment of the Muslim community, to which my father devoted his entire life. Rather than come to our aid and support, we witnessed a complete shock and crippling fear that struck the very core of American Muslim community, whose members worried that they might be targeted next. So for a while I was deeply resentful, I was upset, our phone would go for days without ringing, nobody would check on us. Because my father was so active outside of the Muslim community as well, he was just so diligent, just working with everybody and building allies and friends everywhere, that it was people like Mel, it was a coalition of the social justice wing of churches who came. It was pastors who would visit him in jail, professors, colleagues, and people outside of the Muslim community. And which leads me to my next point, that I now believe actually that the Muslim community is even more vulnerable today than it was 10 years ago or over 10 years. It's worse now than in the immediate aftermath after 9/11, and I think people are feeling the heat and feeling more vulnerable now. The bigots are emboldened, they feel they've won, they've become more vicious, more violent, and so my recommendations to you as supporters, as allies, is that, tell your friends about the work of NCPCF. Talk to them about these cases, because it's not enough for Muslims to show up at the trial. We've been so vilified in the media. Now any word of Muslim is almost directly equivalent to the word terrorist. That they see a Muslim, I don't know that it would help. So we need non-Muslim allies. Just like people showed up at the airports protesting the ban, we need Muslims at these non-Muslim allies at these courthouses. We need people to lift the stigma of these terror-related cases because it's just government overreach and it's an abuse of power. Many of these people are mentally ill or mentally deficient or vulnerable. The case of Sami Al-Arian, you know, one story I heard is that he was at a war within himself. He was so, you know, like I think he was schizophrenic and he had so many problems that somebody told him, do this and you'll get a free trip to Mecca, where he thought he could like have some cleansing thing and he can like gain his like mental faculties or something. Like all he wanted was some sort of treatment for his mental health issues. And so with that, and instead the government, you know, sentences him, what, 41 years? Yeah. So, you know, and if it hadn't been, I strongly believe, if it hadn't been for Mel and our non-Muslim allies, every day in the blazing Florida sun, this is June, this is July, this is August, you know, carrying signs that say everyone deserves a fair trial, justice for all, or whatever, you know, for the jurors to come in and see these people and to know that, you know, maybe we should view, you know, the evidence more closely. I strongly believe that that helps. So what we're doing as NCPCF and Project Salam is to go around the country educating people, try to lift the stigma. People hear, you know, terrorism case or whatever, they automatically assume guilt, but dig deeper, talk to your friends about it, sign up for our listserv, like us on social media, and we'll continue to send you information on the cases as they develop and how you can help. We have the Families Conference, and yeah.
Can write to the prisoners.
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And we do every year a Ramadan Fund campaign where we collect money to send $100 to the commissary accounts of, like, how many was it? Almost 200 Muslim prisoners in these cases, and that's a great thing. They really appreciate it.